I'm sure many of you will know that our current royal family are keen sailors. In fact, the royal family have been for some time. The first official royal yacht was the HMY Mary. HMY stands for His or Her Majesty's Yacht. This was gifted to Charles II by the Dutch in 1660. But since then, there have been 83 royal yachts built. Anyway, Queen Elizabeth, of course, went on to marry another keen sailor in the late Prince Philip, who famously raced the Dragon and Flying 15s in the 50s and 60s, often with the legendary boat designer Arthur Fox as crew, but also with his family. In fact, they all went on to maintain a love of the water. For example, Prince Charles, now King Charles III, of course, being one of the first members of a royal family to windsurf in the 70s, and Google tells me that Princess Anne still owns and sails a Rustler 44 in Scotland. But more about the sailing family in a minute. Today's story is about one specific boat, with an honourable mention to another. In fact, let's start with the other. In his later years, King George VI, Queen Elizabeth's father, was quite ill, and it was hoped that travelling might help alleviate some of his symptoms. Don't forget, this was when flying wasn't the safe, reliable form of transport that it is today, so they would have to use ships from the Royal Navy or even passenger liners when required to travel overseas. So to make this a more enjoyable experience, a royal ship was designed and commissioned. The order was given to John Brown Shipyard in Clydebank, the same shipyard that had built the famous ocean liners the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary. However, just 2 days after the order was received, the King passed away. The ship they built became the HMY Britannia and was launched in 1954 and stayed in service until 1997. During its 43-year career, the yacht travelled more than 1 million nautical miles around the world and visited more than 600 ports in 135 countries. Interestingly, it was also the last ship in the Royal Navy where the crew members slept in hammocks, a practice that they'd maintained until 1973. I was lucky enough to have a private tour of the Britannia by Steve, who served on board for many years, and who took great pleasure in showing me all the different bunks that he had slept in when undertaking his various roles and duties on board. Now I tell you this story because the Britannia now resides in Edinburgh and is a major tourist attraction, with close to 500,000 visitors climbing on board every year, these people coming from all over the world just to see it. But alongside Britannia is Bloodhound, the smaller but no less notable royal yacht docked in the historic port of Leith in Edinburgh and the subject of this film. I'll get to the reason why I'm here in Scotland sailing her in a bit, but first let's tell you about Bloodhound and how it came to be. Originally commissioned by a gentleman called Ike Bell, Bloodhound is a 19.2 metre, which is 63 feet for you Americans watching, ocean racing yacht. She was designed by Charles E. Nicholson and built by the famous Campbell Nicholson Boatyard in 1936. She was actually the second of 3 boats that were all commissioned by Ike and all had the same hull but with different rigs. The first built was Foxwell. That had a cutter sloop rig and was launched in 1935. In the following year, Foxhound was followed by Bloodhound. She had the same basic hull shape but used a cutter yawl rig. For those that don't know, a yawl has 2 masts like a ketch, but in a ketch, the second mast, the mizzen, is located in front of the rudder. On a yawl, the mizzen is placed behind the rudder. Finally, he had Stiana built in 1937. He chose to keep Bloodhound, as he considered it the fastest boat, but it's notable that all 3 of these boats are still afloat today. It says a lot about the quality of the design and the build that went into them. So anyway, over the years, Bloodhound has won numerous races, but most notable of these for me is the fact that she has won the famous Fastnet race outright on 2 occasions. She has also placed second on 2 occasions and third on 2 other occasions, plus winning her class and taking line honours on many others, making her one of the most successful offshore racing boats ever. So as I'd said earlier, the Duke of Edinburgh frequently sailed with the Queen and their children in their various keelboats. Interestingly, the Dragon class keelboat they had, called Blue Bottle, was a wedding present for them from the Island Sailing Club in Cowes, Isle of Wight. And Blue Bottle is the only British Dragon to have won an Olympic medal, picking up a bronze in the 1956 Melbourne Olympic Games. when Prince Philip lent it to the British sailing team, and as I said, she won a bronze. So after successfully competing in the Dragon since the war, the family now required a larger yacht that could accommodate them all and follow Britannia to their favourite cruising grounds of Scotland. The yacht needed to be competitive, as the Prince now wanted to race in larger classes. Apparently, Blue Bottle's sailing master, a Lieutenant Commander Michael Jones, found and shortlisted 2 suitable boats for him. They almost bought Latifa, the second boat on the list that was built by William Fyfe, and which interestingly is also still alive and kicking. But despite the substantial alterations needed to refit Bloodhound to a standard that the royal family wanted, Bloodhound was the one that was chosen, allegedly because she was both cheaper and possessed a tiller, the latter of which was apparently a primary specification, and which long-time viewers of this channel will know I wholeheartedly agree with. So they bought Bloodhound in 1962 and had her refitted by Camper and Nicholson's yard in Gosport. Apparently, a top naval architect of the day, John Illingworth, was drafted in to reinvent Bloodhound, as not surprisingly, the 25-year-old yacht had lost some of her competitive edge. However, yacht designs hadn't really progressed much since the turn of the century, with the long keel yacht still king in offshore sailing, and Illingworth was confident that merely changing the rig would keep Bloodhound competitive, and he was proved to be correct. So new aluminium masts replaced the original spruce spars, with the weight saving and height giving improved performance at all points of sail. Indeed, in its first competitive outing, the 1962 Cowes Week, although not placing well overall, Prince Philip achieved a first and 2 second places and was reportedly delighted with their boat. I've no doubt the family had a lot of fun in Bloodhound, but in 1969 she was sold by the royal family and effectively retired from racing. Over time, the boat gradually fell into considerable disrepair and was close to being lost completely. However, in 2002, a gentleman called Richard Carr decided she was too good a boat to lose and purchased her. He then passed the ownership onto Tony McGrail, a yacht surveyor and classic yacht restorer, in 2003. And over the next 3.5 years, she underwent a major internal and external refit to bring her back to her original condition. Then finally, to get up to date, in January 2010, Bloodhound was purchased by the Royal Yacht Britannia Trust and has been berthed alongside Britannia in Leith ever since. I say berthed here, but every year, up until the Covid years, she would spend the summer months at Oban on the west coast of Scotland, being chartered and generally made available to people to go sailing on. In fact, I should point out that throughout the royal ownership, all of their sailing boats were made available to others, helping people discover a love of the water and teaching them to sail. It's the sort of thing that's often forgotten when people criticise the royal family's spending. A lot of good comes from these things to a lot of people. Anyway, this brings us to today. So, just before the Covid years, the people that run and maintain Bloodhound decided it was time to replace the mast. You know, that one that was fitted in 1962. In fact, there was nothing wrong with it, but when you are taking guests on board a boat, you need to know that the rig is sound and it's not going to let anyone down. So an order was placed, and then, well, Covid happened, so nothing got done. But soon after everyone got back to work, the people at Allspars fitted a brand new Selden mast. But unfortunately, it took the volunteers and the trust that run Bloodhound longer to get back up to speed. And of course, then you have other work that needs doing, which holds things up. And anyway, before you know it, 2 years have passed and the boat still hasn't been sailed, which means that the new mast hasn't been checked and signed off, which means that the charters and sailing experiences they offer out of Oban can't happen, and so on. So today was the day that we checked the mast. It started off a bit chaotic because of course the boat hasn't been used for a couple of years. None of the lines on the new mast have ever been used or run, and even finding the right sails was harder than it had to be, buried in the depths of Britannia's engine room. In the end though, she was made shipshape and we cast off. The crew today consisted of the 3 Steves. There's Steve, the man in charge and skipper for this sail. There's the Steve I know, who's like the ship's bosun. And then there's the Steve, who's the sailing skipper and that runs the charters and sail experiences, etc. We also had 2 members of Britannia's shoreside crew that manage the boat while at dock, plus a local rigger who has been responsible for the rig now that it's been fitted, and a rigger from Allspars who I said supplied the Selden mast in the first place and who ultimately gets to say if it's seaworthy or not. Oh, and me, of course. I was basically just a hanger-on, here to help out really, if anyone was short of hands. The plan for the day was pretty straightforward. Get out of the lock, hoist the sails, load up the rig, adjust it, check that it's behaving as it should, and then take her back in. Getting into the lock was more of a drama than it should have been really. A combination of a lock that's built for huge ocean-going ships, not small yachts, lines that were too big for the chains that we had to tie off to, the wind was blowing us off, we had an engine prop combination that meant we had minimal control over our speed, it would only do about 3 knots flat out, and a horrendous amount of prop walk, like many long keel yachts have, but made doubly more problematic by our lack of power. The power problem's a long story in its own, to be honest, but suffice it to say that it'd be sorted out this winter. Anyway, once we were out, everything became much easier. We had about 10 knots from the west and an outgoing tide, so it felt like a little less wind with the wind and tide working together, and ultimately I think both riggers would have liked a bit more, but it was enough, and for its first sail in effectively 4 years, with an ad hoc crew, it was perfect. There isn't much to say about the actual sailing really. She is a lovely boat and slices through the water really cleanly. In fact, you only have to look at its action through the water and the minimal wake that she leaves behind to understand why boat design got stuck in this phase for so long. It would take a brave man to build a light, maximum waterline length, etc. yacht and forgo the apparent efficiencies that this type of yacht brings with it. That's not me saying that old boats are better. In almost all respects, I would rather have a modern design boat than something like this, and in most respects you could easily argue that it would be better. But you can see why these designs stuck around for so long. They did get a lot right. However, for a 63-foot long boat, down below is very cramped, and as you can see, it's currently undergoing another refit, so there wasn't much to look at when I was on board. When you consider this would have been set up for a skipper and crew plus the royal family, none of whom of course should mix, well, you don't get much space. There was a central saloon area with a minimal galley up front. At the rear was the rear quarters with a couple of beds and their own heads, etc. And then up front were bunks for the crew. The skipper would sleep in that little cuddy you can see up top. Anyway, after a couple of hours of fiddling, tacking, fiddling some more, and so on, everyone was happy that the mast was sound, so we headed back. Getting back through the lock this time was pretty uneventful, with the wind and prop walk both working in our favour, and, well, the fact that the guys that worked the lock took pity on us and came out to take our lines made everything much easier. So we arrived back safely, and ironically the last thing to do was to take everything back off that we just put on, because it's the end of the season now and she won't be sailed again this year. But she is going to be lifted out for the winter and have the power problem sorted out now that everything else has been signed off, so that she will be back in action again next year. So thanks to all involved for having me along. I had a great few days away, because not only did I get to sail on this famous old boat, but I used it as an excuse to have a road trip on my bike, effectively the length of our country, which is always fun. So goodbye, or as Hannah would say if she was here, happy sailing.